Okay, so tonight's video is going to focus on plant adaptations and their responses, how they respond to things and what kind of stimuli they respond to. So what we're going to look at first is we're going to focus first on larger plant adaptations to more environmental conditions. So the first one that we have here is drought. Okay, so plants that are experiencing a prolonged drought, okay, they may lose part of their crown. Okay, up at the top area you can see this plant here that's losing leaves, as well as in here how this one is losing leaves. Okay, because the leaves will start to die off because they reallocate their energy, okay, to encourage root growth, because the roots can go search for water. So when they reallocate that energy away from the leaves will die off. And so you might see parts of the plant, parts of the tree dying so that other parts hopefully can still sustain. So in an arid environment, okay, remember arid is dry as well as hot. So in an arid environment, you see a lot of adaptations with the leaves because the plant is trying to avoid too much water loss. It's trying to prevent desiccation or drying out. So you see a lot of leaf adaptations. Okay? Things like the leaf may be very thick, very hard, okay? Very thick, very hard, very few stomata, okay, so that they don't lose as much water, and those few stomata that they have are on the underside of the leaf. Okay, so that's one adaptation you may see of the leaves in an arid environment. Okay, you may also see what are called the trichomes. Okay, those are the little hairs. You saw a picture of those in the last video. Okay, those little hairs, they reflect a lot of light. And so because they reflect the light, sorry, I'm writing super messy, I'll slow down. Okay, so they reflect a lot of light, and so as a result of that, the plant will do a little less transpiration, so it will lose more water. You can also see stomata in what are called surface pits. Okay, and so when the stomata are in the surface pits, it increases the water tension, and so that also reduces the rate of transpiration. And then you see also some of the adaptations of the leaves that are more spine-like, okay? And then the stem will actually do the photosynthesis, like the cactus here. Okay, so the stem is doing the photosynthesis and storing water. So these are all adaptations to help prevent, like I said, the loss of water. You get these hard, thick leaves with very few stomata. You've got the leaves with the little hairs on them that reflect light, so you decrease your transpiration. You have the stomata in those surface pits that's going to help increase the water tension, so it reduces transpiration, as well as the spine-like stems where the leaf is actually not doing photosynthesis, the stem is. Some plants will also have adaptations to deal with flooding. Okay, flooding is an issue because it's a problem for the roots. If y'all remember from one of the previous videos, the roots do gas exchange. Okay, they exchange oxygen. Remember with the little air pockets that are in the soil? They exchange oxygen with the soil to do cellular respiration and form ATP. And if the roots are underwater like this, they cannot get enough oxygen to do respiration and ATP synthesis. So plants that live in an environment where there is the potential of flooding, like a swampland plant where there's seasonal rains where it might flood, they've got some ways to help combat that. Okay, so some of them you may see they have these roots that'll stick up out of the water, and so they can have access to more oxygen. You see that some on like mangrove type trees. You'll see the roots sticking up out of the water, so above the water line, so that it can be exposed to more oxygen. Okay, because as these roots, okay, so there's less oxygen uptake in the roots, So like I said, you get a decrease then in your ATP synthesis because you're decreasing your amount of cellular respiration. Okay, so actually, ironically enough, your leaves may dry out even though even though that plant is sitting there in a flood. Okay, the leaves themselves may dry out as well, and so you may also, it'll decrease the amount of hormones, it'll suppress the hormones that need to be produced for root synthesis. Okay, so root synthesis will stop or slow down because those hormones will be suppressed. So like I said, one of the adaptations they may have is to have roots that are essentially above the traditional flood line so that they can still be exposed to enough oxygen. Okay, so plants that are permanently in a water environment, not a seasonal flood or occasional flood situation, but are in a constant water environment, they may have what are called lenticels. And those are basically large opening or pores along the stem. Again, they may have those roots. They're called adventitious roots. Okay, so they may have the adventitious roots above the water so that they can get enough oxygen to the roots. Okay, their stomata may actually be on the leaf surface instead of on the bottom of the leaf. They may be on top of the leaf so that if the plant sits there and floats on top of the water, then the stomata for gas exchange is actually on the top, on the part that's exposed to the air. Okay? And some of them also have what is called arenicoma. Okay? And arenicoma are air-filled channels. They're used for gas exchange. And so those will move gas between the part of the plant that's above water and the submerged tissues that are underwater that, remember, don't get as much oxygen. So these arenicoma are basically air channels, kind of like the xylem and the phloem transport sap and water sap. The arenicoma are air-filled channels so you can get gas exchange between the above water portion of the plant and the underwater portion. As plants do photosynthesis, they need to transport the products of that photosynthesis. Anything extra needs to be transported down for storage. And some plants, depending upon their nutritional availability, may have some adaptations that they need to help combat any nutritional deficiencies. So let's talk for a second about how essentially the sugars that are made in photosynthesis get transported around the plant, and then we'll look at some adaptations for different nutritional issues. Okay, so the movement of the sugar throughout the plant is done by what's called bulk flow. Okay, and so bulk flow is basically the movement of these products of photosynthesis, and they move from what's called the source, which would be where they're made, to the sink, which is where they're stored. Okay, so sugars will move from source to sink. And so the first part of this is getting the sugar into the sieve tubes. Okay, and so the sugar, so here's my source right here. That's my leaf cell. Okay, and so these sugars go into the sieve tubes, which you'll see are part of the phloem. And that's what the phloem is made out of. So the sugars go into the sieve tubes, and if you think about what you know about water potential, now that I have added the solute to the water potential to the inside of the sieve tube, I have decreased my water potential, right? Because I've made my solute potential become more negative because I have added a solute to those phloem, to that sieve tube. And so because my water potential has been reduced, now I've got water that's going to go into the sieve tube. It'll follow it in there. Okay, so I've got sugar going in there first. Okay, so I've got sugar going in. This reduces my water potential, and so now water moves in by osmosis. And as the sieve tube will fill with water, okay, that's going to generate now a positive pressure. And so that positive pressure is going to push that phloem sap down along the tube. And that positive pressure will be relieved at the bottom because you're going to unload the sugar. And so there's storage cells down at the base of the tube. And so when I unload the sugar, well, what does that do to the water potential of the cell that it moved into? Well, that lowers the solute potential of that cell. So now water is going to leave the sieve tube. Okay, so water will follow it, and water will leave the sieve tube. Okay, and in some plants, they do what's called leaf to root translocation. So the water will actually recycle. It'll go back and it'll go into the xylem to go back up, okay, to be used again, okay, and it will just recycle through the tube. Okay, so we've got some plants that need to do some nutritional adaptations. Okay, and so the first one of those would be plants like epiphytes. Okay, so epiphytes, if you remember what epi is, okay, so epi is a pond, and then a phyte is a plant. So epiphytes are plants that do not harm the host. Okay, they grow on another plant, okay, but they do not harm the other plant that they're growing on. They are not a parasite. Epiphytes, these are plants that, let's say maybe if they were down lower, they wouldn't get enough sunlight. So they anchor into this crook of this tree. They're not stealing water from it. They've got adaptations to either get water from the air or collect it from the rain. They're not stealing minerals from it, but they are able to be exposed to more sunlight to be able to do photosynthesis. Okay, so they do not harm their plant that they are growing on. You also have parasitic plants, though. Parasitic plants that actually will harm the plant that they are growing on. Mistletoe is the example of a photosynthetic parasite, a parasitic plant. It will absorb water, minerals, some sugars from this host tree. So it will be harming that host tree because it is removing nutrients from that host tree. You also have some plants that live in areas where there is very low nitrogen content in the soil. Okay, so I've got a decreased nitrogen availability, and these are going to be your carnivorous plants. So carnivorous plants are still photosynthetic. Okay, they still do photosynthesis, but they need to supplement their diet, mainly because they live in areas where the soil isn't very nutrient rich. A lot of times they're missing nitrogen, which is important for nucleic acid synthesis, for protein synthesis. So they need to supplement and get more nitrogen. And they do that then by eating the insects, the small animals that obviously contain nitrogen because they contain proteins, they contain DNA, they contain RNA. And so they can supplement their photosynthesis that way. Okay, so you also have some plants that have developed adaptations to salt water. Okay, to the high salt content in the water. If you think about it, a high salt content in the soil surrounding the plant would normally dry the plant out, right? It would pull water out of the plant. But these plants that have adapted to the salt water, these are called halophytes. Okay, and so halophytes may have things like spongy leaves. Okay, and these spongy leaves store water. They're able to store water so they can essentially dilute the salt that's down in the roots of the plants. So they have these leaves that are like big giant sponges, okay, and so they store water, and that water then is used to dilute the salt that's coming into the roots of the plant. You also have some that can do active transport of the salt, so they will actively remove the salt from the roots of the plant. You also have some that basically just block the salt and they don't allow it in the first place. Okay, and then you also have some of these that can produce a lot of, they have an increased production of your organic molecules, essentially of your solutes. And so because they have this increased production of these organic molecules, they can affect the water potential of the roots, which can impact how much of the salty water is coming into the roots. Okay, so these halophytes, like I said, they have a wide range of things that can help combat the salt. They can dilute the salt with the water stored in the spongy leaves. They can just remove it. They can block it. Or like I said, they can also impact how much of the salt water they're taking up by altering their solute potential with those their solute potential, and so in turn their water potential by making more of these organic molecules. So in addition to these large-scale adaptations, that are happening over long periods of time, and then this slow-moving evolutionary process, the individual plant also has the ability to respond to stimuli. Okay, the trees that are sitting in your front yard right now can respond to drought conditions. They can respond to sunlight exposure. They can respond to gravity. Okay, so the plant itself has the ability to respond to a stimulus. And so plant response is going to be triggered by hormones. Okay, so plants have a wide variety of hormones that can signal the plant response, and it's the same basic pathway as your other cells that we've talked about. Okay, at this point, it probably seems like you guys have seen this diagram like a million times, okay, but it's the same basic cell communication signal pathway. Okay, we've got initial reception of the signal. So in plants, hormones, as a general rule, moderate these. Okay, they trigger your signal transduction pathway. There's going to be we were studying humans. Remember, we could sometimes have the nervous system. There's no nervous system in the plants to be our signal. Okay, but with plants, there's going to be hormones that are signaling these transduction pathways. So remember, we've got the reception portion of it. Okay, so I've got the reception portion of it where the signal's detected, the receptor proteins, they'll change their shape and respond to the stimulus. And when they change their shape, that usually triggers this transduction pathway here, which is going to be your pathway that's going to help, remember, it amplifies the signal. Okay, so this is where your amplification will happen, okay, and it's going to help get the response going. Okay, you've got your relay proteins, your second messengers, okay, and then your response is the very last thing, where you can have basically two kinds of response. You can either affect protein production, so you can impact the messenger RNA. I can increase or decrease messenger RNA production, okay, which essentially I can stimulate genes or turn them off, okay, or I can activate existing molecules. Remember, most of our protein-based or amino acid-based hormones, they bound to the receptor on the outside on the cell membrane, and they activated existing molecules. Most of our steroid-based hormones, can travel all the way into the DNA and directly impact the DNA and what's being expressed. So I'm going to give you some examples of plant hormones. You do not have to memorize these plant hormones. Okay, you don't have to memorize what they do. It's really just to kind of make you just kind of familiar with the terms and to let you get an idea of the wide variety of plant hormones that are out there. Okay, so the first one we've got here is auxin. Okay, auxin is important for cell elongation. It's really one of the main hormones that drives the response to the tropisms, which we've talked a little bit about tropisms when you guys were freshmen with phototropism and geotropism. Okay, so auxin is one of the main hormones that helps control those things, and one of the ways it does it by impacting cell elongations. I also have cytokines that will stimulate cytokinesis or cell division. So they will encourage growth by encouraging the divisions of cells. The cytokines also do cell differentiation or specialization. We talked about there's different kinds of tissues, ground tissue, dermal tissue, vascular tissue. And so cells in a plant do need to specialize or differentiate. Okay, and then we've got gibberellins. I can't spell or write again tonight. Okay, and these are important again for cell elongation. Okay, which can have an impact. The plant can't move, but it can bend and change shape, and a lot of that's going to be due to cell elongation. Okay, your next one. Okay, abscisic acid. Cannot write again tonight. Okay, this one is going to kind of slow the plant down. Okay, this one actually promotes dormancy of the seed. Remember we talked about when the seed is ready to germinate, it's going to start with the inhibition. That's going to trigger hormone responses. Okay, well this particular hormone promotes the seed going into that dormant state. Okay, so it's going to decrease or slow growth in addition to triggering the dormancy. Okay, and the last example of a plant hormone that we're going to give you is ethylene. Ethylene is actually a gas. Okay, ethylene is important for fruit ripening. If your mom or your grandmother, if you get some, tomatoes or fruit that's not quite ripe from the store, and they put it in a brown bag on the counter to help it ripen, what they're doing, okay, whether they realize it or not, is they're trapping that ethylene gas. As the fruit starts to ripen, okay, it releases the ethylene gas, which encourages ripening in nearby fruit. And so they're trapping that ethylene gas, and so it will encourage ripening of all the fruits in the bag there. Ethylene also signals the plant cells for apoptosis. Remember that programmed cell death? Okay, so you've got really letting you see that you've got a wide variety of plant hormones that are out there. Okay, so let's look at some of the responses a plant can have to a stimulus. Remember, these responses, they're called tropisms. Okay, so a tropism is basically any turning or bending movement of the organism toward or away from a stimulus. It's a positive tropism, so you can have a positive or it can be negative. It's a positive if it bends or leans toward the stimulus. It's a negative tropism if it bends or leans away from the stimulus. So the one we're looking at here, okay, is phototropism. And hopefully you remember that photo is light. Okay, so this is the plant's response to light. Okay, and so phototropism, the plants have what are called phytochromes. Okay, and those phytochromes are basically light receptors, and they can detect light direction, intensity, and wavelength. And those phytochromes will send the signal. And again, the response here is going to be due to auxin. You can see this cell elongation happening here. The cells on the side away, here's your sun over here. Okay, so the cells on the side away from the sun will elongate, causing that plant to bend towards the sun. These cells over here do not shorten. It's the ones on the far side elongate. Okay, and so this light response here, so this instance here is a positive phototropism. It's bending toward the light. A lot of you guys have probably seen this with like your parent, your mom, or your grandmother. If you keep houseplants and you keep them like near a window or light source, your mom or your grandmother may spin it around on occasion because the plant starts kind of leaning towards the window, and that's because of this positive phototropism. And so you spin it around, so it kind of makes itself become upright again. It leans the other direction towards the light. So along that same line of response to light, we have what's called photoperiodism. Okay, so photoperiodism is a reaction to the length of the light exposure. Okay, so a reaction to the length essentially of day and night. It's part of why plants bloom at different times of the year, because of the different amount of light exposure, the length of the light exposure, or even darkness. There's a critical dark and a critical lightness. So photoperiodism is not just limited to plants. Okay, photoperiodism does have an impact on animals as well. Okay, so you've got certain animals that will respond. They'll have physiological reactions. Okay, so not just a response like, oh, I bent towards the light or I'm leaning towards the light. We're talking a physiological reaction. There are physiological changes happening in the organism, okay, due to the length of their light exposure, of their day or night. So it can occur in plants and animals. As a general rule, it's your photoperiodism is controlled by the length of the nighttime, okay, of the darkness, the exposure they have to darkness. Okay, and so these plants are known to have a developmental response, in particular with blooming, okay, and flower blooming, in response to the length of light in dark periods. So what you see, you think about winter time. There's a longer dark period So there's an increased darkness during the winter time, and so a large amount of plants do not bloom during that time. They have the physiological change that's not a good time for them to bloom because they get this stimulus of how long the darkness is there. So what we have down here is what's called a short day plant. We're going to look at a short day plant versus a long day plant. So a short day plant is one that will flower, okay, but it will only flower when their darkness exposure, or when nighttime, that would probably be shorter and easier to write. Okay, so the only exposure when their night exceeds a critical period. So these want a long nighttime exposure. And they're not impacted by normal night, let's call them normal nighttime light, like moonlight or lightning. That's not strong enough, nor does it last long enough to really interrupt that dark period. But they require a considerably long dark period of darkness, and if they don't get that, they will not bloom. And if there's an interruption to that darkness, they will not bloom. Like a prolonged flash of light during that darkness time, they will not bloom. It will interrupt their flowering. So for example, here I've got a plant there that's not flowering because here's my critical dark period, okay, and this one wasn't long enough. Okay. This second plant, though, it exceeded the critical dark period, so I got my flowering. The third plant there exceeded the critical dark period, but it had this interrupting flash of light, so I get no bloom. Okay, so on the flip side of that short day plant, we also have what's called a long day plant. Okay, and so the long day plant, these are going to flower when the night is shorter than your critical dark period. Okay, so these only flower when these are exposed to a much shorter period of darkness. They need a longer exposure to light. Okay, so they need their day to be a little bit longer. So when you're looking at your diagram over here, so you can see this plant flowered because here's my critical dark period right there, and the darkness was shorter than that. This one here does not bloom because the darkness is longer than my critical period. And this one down here, even though it does bloom, okay, that darkness is interrupted by that flash of light. And that flash of light is a big enough, strong enough, bright enough interruption, okay, that the flower will still bloom because it wasn't a consistent, long period of darkness. And so these are things that will bloom in the spring, early summertime, when the days are getting longer and the nights are getting a little bit shorter. Things like spinach, radishes, lettuce. Okay, and my next one here is called Gravitropism. Okay, and so remember, tropism is my response, so this is going to be my response to gravity. Okay, it's also sometimes called geotropism. Okay, geotropism, gravitropism, same thing. So it's response to gravity, and a lot of times the plants will have multiple geotropism or gravitropism response. Okay, so these responses can be positive or negative. I don't think you really have. We talked about the phototropism earlier being positive. I don't think you ever really have a negative phototropism. But you're going to have, as a general rule, every plant is going to have both a positive and a negative geotropism, right? The roots usually will have a positive geo or gravitropism. They are going to go down towards gravity. Okay, so they're not going to oppose it. And then your stem, okay, is going to have a negative geotropism. It's going to grow up and away from gravity. That's actually not what's happening there. Okay, so your stem is growing up away from gravity while your roots are going down. So you've got a positive and negative geotropism happening in the same plant. You can see this seed here, this root, no matter what direction they put the seed, that root will bend back down, okay, to go with gravity, to have that positive grava or geotropism response. Our last one here is called Sigmatropism. And if you guys remember that one, what that one is, that is its response to contact or touch. So the plant will respond to something touching it, or something changing its shape. So touch or contact. You can see an example of this here. The vine touches the pole, and so as it touches the pole, it wraps around it. So that would be an example of a thigmotropism, a positive thigmotropism. It goes towards that stimulus. Here you can see two carnivorous plants here, that both have thigmotropic responses. When the prey moves a portion of the plant, the plant will respond to that to help trap and ensnare the prey. So these are your plant adaptations and responses, and this is the end of your plants. This is your last plant video, and so we will be moving on from here.